I grew up in Pittsburgh, and in particular in the South Hills. I grew up in a neighborhood called Scott Township, and being Jewish, I was actually the only Jew in my grade at school. So it's always been this othering piece for me, but part of the history of the Jewish people has also been a huge aspect and part of my identity, and it's not something I really wanted to ever shy away from, but I really resonated with, I think, Ryan, who was sitting behind me and might have left, talked about parts of our identity that we leave when we enter different spaces. And for me, growing up, when I would go to school, there were huge swaths of time where I would leave or try to leave that part of my identity out of the room because you want to fit in, right? And so when I think about that from where it culminates from in Judaism, like we can go back, you go into the Old Testament and you talk about the Romans, the Greek, the Babylonians, and how like the Israelites, the Jewish people, were conquered time and time again, pushed out of place from that perspective. There's hundreds of or thousands of years I'll skip at that point and go into, we have the diaspora, the Spanish Inquisition, and Jews being persecuted in Spain and places like that, and the commonality across this, because it wasn't just the Jewish people who were discriminated against at that period of time, right? And hopefully we'll hear other aspects of these stories tonight. To restrictions placed in Eastern Europe, where there's a lot of like Ashkenazi Jewish like heritage and settlement, through a place called the Pale of Settlement, which was part of like Russia and the Soviet Union, this pre-Soviet Union actually. So Jews weren't allowed to live in the bigger cities in Russia at that time. There were certain areas only that we could live in. In the 1800s, there were pogroms or like community uprisings that were placed upon the Jewish community in there. There were restrictions around military service and things of that nature in the Jewish community. My family was living in that area at that part of and that time period and experienced a lot of those atrocities. I'm sure some of you in the room had similar experiences. Even moving forward, you can talk about the United States in the early 1900s, and when Jews would come to America at that point in time, there were quotas on the number of Jews who could come into the country, how many Jews could enter an educational institute of higher education, job restrictions as to how many Jews could be employed by specific places, restricted covenants on where we could live. So growing up in the South Hills, one of the places I know that happened is Virginia Manor in the South Hills. There, if you look back at the deeds from that period in time, they didn't want you to sell property to Jews or African Americans. That moved into the Holocaust across Europe, across Eastern Europe, across Europe, and has affected the Jewish people to this day from that standpoint, right? There's survivors who are grandparents' age and things of that nature, and how we identify, or if we identify at all any longer because of what happened, they choose to not share that aspect or piece of their identity any longer. And even after that, in this country, it shifted for the Jewish people, right? Because for the Ashkenazi Jewish people, like I am a white person, and before World War II, that was not the case in this country. Ashkenazi Jews were not considered white. And so since World War II, we've had so much privilege that we've been able to take advantage of that lots of other folks have not had the same opportunities, from the GI Bill that we're able to utilize after World War II to purchase homes that creates like intergenerational wealth and other things that lots of other people have not had the same opportunities. And that leads up to, you think about anti-Semitism for the last 6 years at Repair the World. It's not a thing I really focused on a lot. We've talked a lot more about racism and working with making sure we're building relationships in the African American community. But the focus hasn't really been on anti-Semitism, and we just weren't thinking about it in the same way, because it's not something that ever goes away, but it certainly is something that ebbs and flows. And the last couple years in the post-2016 aftermath, this is something that's been on the rise. Anti-Semitic attacks are up at least 60% in the last 2 years. In particular, I know there's members of Dor Hadash here tonight, and there were the attack on October 27th at the synagogue space and against those congregations, in part was not alone on just the fact that it was a synagogue and there were Jews inside, but also because there was collaboration with HIAS and working with organizations to bring immigrants and refugees into this country and settle people into America and to become a more welcoming space for everyone. And that's a huge reason as to why the synagogue was targeted in the first place, and it's not something that gets talked about all the time. So I just want to make sure that I mention that. I'm happy to turn this over to our next person, and we can start to see the weaving of all the commonality.